Oh God.
Hello.
Hello. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good. So I'm back whenever you are ready.
I'm ready. I'm just waiting for the participants to fill in.
Mhm.
I can admit 100 here in the Zoom, and there are participants who are filling up in the YouTube thing as well, because this is going live. This is streaming live on
Yeah,
YouTube at the same time. Oh God.
right. Hello.
Yes, yes. Hello. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good. Robin, can you hear us? Robin? Can Robin hear us? Us? Robin?
Robin.
Can Robin hear
Professor
us?
Robin Field. Professor Robin Field.
Robin, can you hear us?
Yes.
Robin?
Oh.
Okay.
Sorry, I just stepped out of my office.
Yeah. Yeah, Parna, there is a time lag. Robin?
Robin.
Yes,
Can Robin hear us?
Professor Robin Field.
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Professor Robin Field.
Robin, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Robin.
Can Robin
Yes.
hear us?
Professor Robin Field.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Robin, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Aparna, there is an echo and there is a time lag. So I said, Robin, can you hear me? That has been repeated about. Can you hear me?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Sure, sure. Robin. I can hear you.
Can Robin
Yes.
hear us?
Robin Field.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Robin, Yeah. can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Yeah, Aparna, there's a technical difficulty and there's a time lag.
Yes, I
So I
understand.
said, Robin, can you hear me? That has been repeated about.
Yes, yes. I'm trying
Can
to
you
work
hear
on
me?
that. Just give me 5
Yeah.
minutes. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Sure, sure. Robin. I can hear you.
Can Robin hear us?
Robin Field.
Yes.
Say there's a repetition problem that needs to be fixed.
Yes,
Aparna,
we are
there's a technical difficulty.
Yes,
There's
yes.
a
I'm
time
trying to
lag.
fix that.
So I said, Robin, can you hear me? That has been repeated about.
Yes, yes. I'm trying
Can
to
you
work
hear
on
me?
that. Just give me 5
Yeah.
minutes. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Sure, sure. Robin.
Can Robin hear us?
Robin Field.
Yes.
Say there's a repetition problem that needs to be fixed.
Yes,
Aparna,
we are
there's a technical difficulty.
Yes,
There's
yes.
a
I'm
time
trying to
lag.
fix that.
So I said, Robin, can you hear me? That has been repeated about.
Yes, yes. I'm trying
Can
to
you
work
hear
on
me?
that. Just give me 5 minutes. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Problem going on.
Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Sure, sure.
Yeah,
Robin.
voice.
Can Robin hear us?
Robin Field.
Yes.
Say there's a repetition problem that needs to be fixed. Aparna,
we are
there's a technical difficulty.
Yes,
There's
yes.
a
I'm
time
trying to
lag.
fix that. I'm trying
So I said, Robin, can you hear me? That has been repeated about.
Yes, yes. I'm trying
Can
to
you
work
hear
on
me?
that. Just give me 5 minutes. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Keep the mobiles outside.
Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Sure, sure. Robin.
Voice.
Can Robin hear us?
Robin Field.
Yes.
I'll just switch it off.
Say there's a repetition problem that needs to be fixed. Aparna, there's a technical difficulty.
Yes,
There's
yes.
a
I'm
time
trying to
lag.
fix that. I'm trying
So I said, Robin, can you hear me? That has been repeated about.
Yes, yes. I'm trying
Can
to
you
work
hear
on
me?
that. Just give me 5 minutes. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Keep the mobiles outside.
Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Sure, sure. Robin.
Voice.
Can Robin hear us?
Robin Field.
Yes.
Say there's repetition problem that needs to be fixed. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Keep the mobiles outside.
I can hear you.
Just keep the mobiles away. All of you, please.
There's a repetition problem that needs to be fixed. Can you hear me? This is awful. What you and I said 5 minutes ago, it keeps getting repeated. We are not saying anything new.
All of you, please.
Yeah. Anyway,
Mohan, please fix
this is
this.
awful. What you and I said 5 minutes ago, it keeps getting repeated. We are not saying anything. And fortunately, she is sitting in the control room, and the techie is sitting right. Oh no, I shouldn't do that. Okay, well, I'll do, the techie is there. I hope he can fix it. Okay, bye.
Ma'am, can you hear me, ma'am?
I can hear you, Amrit.
Yeah, thank you, Robin Field. Actually, we're just trying to check because earlier the live was creating some sort of an issue. It was creating echo.
Let's do some testing again.
Can you hear me, ma'am?
Yes, I can hear you, Bhupati. Professor Robin, can you hear me clearly now?
I can hear you, Amrit.
There's no reverberation. There's no echo right now.
Yeah, thank you, Robin Field.
I think it has been fixed. Yeah, it has been fixed.
Thank
Live
you.
was creating
Just wanted
some
to
sort of
check.
an issue.
Yeah,
It
fine.
was
Great.
creating echo.
Thank you, guys.
I hear some echo on my end, though.
You do? Perhaps have you also opened your YouTube link along with the Zoom link?
Let's do some testing again.
See, that's what
So
Amrit just said.
the repetition problem is continuing.
Robin, can you hear me clearly now?
I can hear you, Amrit.
There's no reverberation. There's no echo right now.
Yeah, thank you, Robin Field.
I think it has been fixed. Yeah, it has been fixed.
Thank you. Just wanted to check. Request all the participants to just open the Zoom link right now, those who are admitted in the Zoom, and please switch off your YouTubes. All the participants, I think I better type this out.
Because in the same
Yeah, both they are open.
their system will record it and it will delay.
Request all the participants to just open the Zoom link right now, those who are admitted in the Zoom, and please switch off your YouTubes. All the participants, I think I better type this out. Hello, tell me.
Because in the same
Oh, no, you please click on the Zoom link. Don't click on the YouTube link.
close the YouTube.
Okay. No, I'm. Request all the participants to just open the Zoom link right now, those who are admitted in the Zoom, and please switch off your YouTubes. Mute all. All the participants. I'll mute all. I think I'm going to type this out. Hello, tell me. सबको म्यूट कर दिया अभी हाँ. Oh, No, you please click on the Zoom link. Don't click on the YouTube link.
He is not able to enter. Professor Rahman is not able to enter.
Bhupati, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. I'm able to hear you.
Is there any echo sound?
So far, no.
Okay.
Now
unmute.
it's fine.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll ideally mute and unmute from my end as and when the panelists, the speakers come in.
Sure, ma'am. Sure.
You're
No
right.
issues. Yeah.
All right. Bhupati, can you hear me?
Again. See, now again.
Yeah. It's getting echoed actually. I think the live is. Can you just stop the live and start again? Just because I think that is creating some sort of a problem. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, let's see what comes. So ma'am is trying to. She doesn't want us to be. Hmm? Muruganandan, I'll talk to him. I'll talk to him just a second, wait. அண்ணா என்னண்ணா அவங்க பேசுறதெல்லாம் என்ன கொடுக்கல, எனக்கே கொடுக்கல. அவங்க ஏதோ அவங்களே பாத்துக்கிறேன்றாங்க, இதை பார்த்துட்டு போறாங்க. அப்ப என்னன்னா இல்ல பேசுறது ஃபுல்ல எக்கோ ஆகிட்டே இருக்குண்ணா. அவங்க பேசுறது அப்படி ஏன் அப்படி இப்ப அப்படியா? ஏதாவது எக்கோ ஆகுது என்னன்னு தெரியல. வரல ஏதோ லைவ் போயிட்டு இருக்கேன். லைவ்னால ஏதாவது பிரச்சனை வருமா? 2 தடவை ரிப்பீட் ஆகுமா ஏதாவது? அதான் 20 செகண்ட் கழிச்சு இங்கேயும் உள்ளேயும் வருது. ஓ, அந்த ப்ரௌசரை க்ளோஸ் பண்ண சொல்லணுமா? ஓகே, ஒரு நிமிஷம் நான் சொல்றேன். ஓகே. ம். ஆமா. யூடியூப்லயா? ஆமா. ஓ, இப்போ வந்து ஆமா. ஓகே. இப்போ வந்து இப்போ அந்த ப்ரௌசரை க்ளோஸ் பண்ண சொல்லிடலாமா? யூடியூப் ப்ரௌசரை. ஒரு நிமிஷம். அதனால எக்கோ ஆகுமோ? Okay, also. Ma'am, actually, it is getting echoed, right? Because we have actually opened that YouTube this thing. I mean, the YouTube browser. YouTube browser can be closed. Yeah. Your Zoom only should be on. Your Zoom only should be open. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Just close the YouTube browser. Yes, ma'am. Hello. No, but I'm saying that just
Okay, Bhupati?
yes,
Hello.
ma'am. I'm able to hear you. Hello.
Yes, I can hear you too.
Yes, ma'am. Let's just wait whether if it is getting echoed or not.
So far, did it echo? Okay, Bhupati?
No, ma'am. No. It's not
Yes, ma'am.
getting echoed.
Yeah,
I think
I'm able to hear you.
I think we are set. I guess. Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you too.
Yes, ma'am. Let's just wait whether if it is
No,
getting
it is
echoed or not.
echoing. It is echoing.
Yes, it is echoing actually. Yes.
Stop live streaming.
If we stop live stream and again do it,
So far, did it echo? Okay, Bhupati?
again. Bhupati, waiting to reply.
How do I admit
Just
all?
click on no.
Click where?
On that.
Waiting room?
No, you have admitted them.
Who is there? Who were there? I don't know.
Okay, now try.
No, Professor Anis or Rahman, I want to see. Who are the participants? How do I see?
Try. All the participants here. What was the name?
Anis or Rahman? ANIS.
Maybe he's using different name.
Okay, can you try
Just check
with
now.
Bhupati
Check
now?
now. It's not. No, it will not.
Bhupati? Bhupati?
Yes, ma'am, I'm able to hear you.
I am getting messages from some colleagues saying that it's not echoing.
It will not echo now.
Yeah.
It will not echo now. So you unmute yourself.
Yeah.
I'll mute.
No, wait, we'll try.
Wait.
Just 2 minutes.
Just wait for 2 minutes. We'll try and then we'll get started.
I think now no echo, ma'am.
Great.
Okay.
Thank heavens for that. Oof.
I
Little
think no
much.
echo.
Professor Rahman and
Professor Rahman, I don't know if he's using another ID. I'm still waiting for Professor Rahman to enter.
Send him WhatsApp.
Just send it from my mobile.
I don't know his name. Just have time. You just have time. Relax. We finish.
I've sent him this link. Send
just
him.
check whether that's the correct link.
Just save this.
Simple.
Aparna?
Yes, Professor Singh, can you hear me?
I think we should start.
Okay.
Anis will join because
Yeah.
people have been waiting for 45
Can
minutes.
we just wait for 5 minutes? My department colleague, Professor Samson, will join us. And can we wait for 5 minutes and then get started, please?
Well, it's up to you. You are in charge, but I think people may want us to get started.
We haven't admitted enough. There are just 28 participants in the Zoom. Of course, it's going live right now on YouTube. But I feel if we can just wait for 5.
It's the same. What he's saying, this is a recurring meeting.
Yeah.
I think that is.
You call him and just tell him that.
No,
What to tell him?
click on that link.
Just ask him to click on the Zoom link and get in. People are getting admitted now.
They're getting invitations.
Hello, sir. Yeah, please
Can we
try
send an
to
invite
click
to
on the
him from
link
here?
and you can now get in. You already there.
You're there.
Because-
If he's there, we can start.
Okay, because he has been there for.
He's there.
What is? He said.
It doesn't give permission to enter. No, but there is nobody waiting. I mean, it shows if there is somebody waiting, it shows that people are waiting. There are Professor Robin and Amritjeet Singh are already in.
Give me his number. I text him this. I'll text him on your WhatsApp.
One of my students is texting you again on your WhatsApp. Please open your WhatsApp link at least. So, okay. Sure.
No.
Just set him on his name.
Wait.
Hello, Bhupati. Hold on for a minute.
Forward it to.
Yes, Bhupati.
Hello, are we ready now?
Yes, yes, in a minute, please. Hello, everybody. Times are difficult and we have to rely on technology and all the settings. So Professor Rahman, are you in?
Yes, I'm in. Hi,
Okay.
I'm in.
Yeah, he is here. Yeah.
Yay.
Hey.
Okay. So a warm welcome and a very good evening on behalf of the Department of English Literature, School of Literary Studies, English and Foreign Languages, University Hyderabad. Once again, I'm thankful to all of you for your patience. We were having some technical issues, and since the last 2 days, it has been raining incessantly here in Hyderabad with power cuts and internet cuts. It's been really a trying time for all of us and also the technicians here. Even while I'm sitting here in the control room, we're still facing the power cuts here. So once again, I accord a warm welcome to all the esteemed panelists and to those thousands of people watching us live, to those 1,500 odd participants who have shown great enthusiasm to an interest and have registered themselves for this webinar. I welcome you all. Since I'm not able to locate my colleague here, Professor Sampson, who was supposed to do the welcome note. So let me do that on his behalf. Uh, Ever since I made this proposal to the Honorable Vice Chancellor, he had been very proactive in approving this. And I'm very glad that I'm able to host this and that many registered participants could participate in this, which also is a testimony to the fact that these webinars are so very desired and so important. This kind of dialogue is very important. So I'm really thankful to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Suresh Kumar, because of his hectic schedules and since it's been raining webinars and lectures at the university and with his prior engagements, he couldn't be here. Otherwise, I'm sure he would have loved to be part of this webinar. Diaspora, Gender and Marginality, which is the theme of our webinar. Just going by the concept note, we know that diaspora studies have come a long way and they have moved beyond our traditional understanding to newer theoretical formulations, acquainting us with contemporary modes, patterns, and worldviews, in addition to the collective and individual psyche of the diasporic subject. The changing socio-political situations further complicate, reshape, and problematize diasporic conceptualization and affiliation. Diasporic writings have emerged from their own socio-historical cultural baggage, and since their genealogy cannot be traced to any one particular origin, the idea of homogeneity should not subsume the uniqueness and multiplicity evidently visible in the socio-linguistic, political, multinational, and transnational manifestations. Marginalization of transnational communities and multicultural host nations on different grounds, and the ways in which it is reinterpreted, emerge from the diasporic consciousness of the subject and initiate further responses to the concept of marginality. At the same time, the presence of transnational feminist alliances and the contestations of marginality in diversified spaces reflect on the capability of challenging the Western epistemes in their situatedness, while allowing the transnational experiences to transform the subject's relation to their origin from their gendered subjective positions, further reorganizing the tropes and their fixities within diaspora. The emerging field within diaspora studies, given the unpremeditated global reach of technology and media, are garnering interest across academic disciplines. The engagement and discussion on the necessity of recognition and acceptance of diasporic communities have especially been very loud and demanding in the last few decades. Similarly, the silencing within its popular discourses has become a matter of serious academic inquiry in relation to gender, disability, caste, identity, and further beseeches the need to look at the inextricable link between them and address the intersectionality of multiple marginalities. Literature, of course, has played a very important role in formation of diasporic cultures. Women writers particularly are offering a decentering approach to diasporic displacement and show how contemporary identities get reconfigured in transnational flows. The question still remains, is this transnational configuration an exclusive thing to diaspora alone? If the condition of hybridity is one of its constituent features that have proceeded unevenly, then are these cultural hybridities restricted to an individual in a diaspora alone? How reliable are these notions of cultural integration and hybridization? Isn't the idea of a portable home and flexible immigrant present in both diaspora and non-diaspora locale? Further, the very experience of mobility has influenced the way migrants construct their identities in a state of in-betweenness. Perhaps the two concepts that can help in describing specificities of this writing is the concept of transmigrant itself and the concept of cultural demythologization that perhaps undercuts the abstract notion of diasporic imagination. In an era of satellite and internet and wider communication technologies, which have created diasporic public spheres where the feeling of loss is increasingly redundant, diaspora and its multidimensionality de-essentializes the process of identity construction, social relations, as well as the notion of sense of belonging. The COVID-19 pandemic that has kept us locked up inside our homes is giving an altogether new dimension to the concept of loss experienced within homes, and at the same time, it's creating larger networks and platforms of virtual community that is eroding national and international boundaries. The present webinar aims to focus on diasporic literary productions by bringing together both national and international scholars engaged in the field of diaspora studies and addressing issues of gender marginality from literary, cultural, historical, and ethno-political perspectives. It also intends to create a platform for the ongoing engagement in the respective fields that can further the process of research and dialogue. Having said this, today we have an esteemed panel of speakers that includes Professor Amritjeet Singh, who has joined us already, Professor Robin Field, and Professor Anisur Rahman. Before I call upon my first speaker to come up, I would love to briefly introduce him. Professor Amritjeet Singh is the Langston Hughes Professor of English at Ohio University, a visiting fellow at South Asia Institute, University of Texas, Austin. He's the past president of Multi-Ethnic Literature of the United States, that is MILIS, SALA, that's South Asian Literary Association, and he has received Lifetime Achievement and Distinguished Achievement Awards respectively from both these literary bodies. He's been a visiting fellow, he has held visiting positions at Wesleyan University, New York University, UC Berkeley, and has widely traveled and taught endlessly in various continents. He's an editor of more than 20 books who has had the distinguished honor of, He has the distinguished honor of fetch script published by Fairleigh Dickinson in his honor. Well, these are many, just a few of his accomplishments, and I guess there are many, many more. Professor Singh, these and many more accomplishments of Professor Singh are in the wider public domain and perhaps can be Google searched, But what cannot be listed by Google is perhaps his buoyancy, his matchless candor, his astounding sincerity, his remarkable spontaneity, his confident ardor to see things go smoothly. And we have been witness to that right till the time we started the webinar. I think these are a few of those defining traits in his very elemental persona that I came across in my communication and correspondences with him. And I insist that Google should list these as well soon someday. Thousands of friends are watching this live. May I present to you Professor Amritjeet Singh.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, you are very audible, Amrit. You are audible.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you all for your patience. I, in fact, got up very early, and I hope we can have good conversations. I, first of all, thank Dr. Aparna Lanjevar-Bose for inviting me to join this wonderful conversation on the diaspora. I was very impressed with the way she approached me, but also as many of you, some of you very close friends listening, know that I have a soft corner for Hyderabad. I had spent my youthful years in Hyderabad. I came to Hyderabad at the age of 28 to serve as academic associate at American Studies Research Center. And then I moved to University of Hyderabad as a founding member of the English department faculty. That included, among others, Professor Shivke Kumar, Professor Nagarajan, Chirantan Kulshrestha, Arvind Krishan Mehrotra, Meena Alexander, and several others. And so Hyderabad is a very special part of my memory and my life. I also, I wanted to clarify a couple of things at the beginning before I start reading the pages I have prepared. One is to explain the title of the talk, Palimpsest or Disjuncture. Now, some of you have come across the word palimpsest. It's very fondly used by someone who has been causing a lot of problems in India today. His name is Jawaharlal Nehru. In his book, The Discovery of India, he uses this concept as the layered idea of Indian civilization. Palimpsest is the goat skin on which manuscripts were written in ancient Greece and in ancient India, and other animal skins, and they were reused. These people were very environmentally conscious. They didn't want to waste these goat skins that were very useful for writing the manuscripts. So Nehru talks about the three layers: the Sanskrit layer, and the Persian layer, and the English layer. And he sees Indians as a mixture of those three very powerful influences. Why am I using it in the diasporic context? For a very simple reason, because when someone like me leaves India, and I've never left India, as you know, I'm there every year to have conversation with you all over India. But when a person migrates, they cannot completely shed what they bring from their homeland. This idea that you can leave behind whatever the layers of your experience, the layers of your identity were, and you can start all over. And Professor Robin Field and I are going to make a reference to a particularly popular but also somewhat notorious book called Jasmine by Bharti Mukherjee, which represents a kind of breezy assimilationism, the idea that you can leave behind whatever and you can create a new identity. Yes, new identities are created, but they are created in a much more complicated fashion than cutting with your roots. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing I want to mention before I read the pages is that there's a lot of pressure right now on all the critical terms, all the theoretical terms we use. And the term diaspora is no exception, because of certain kinds of developments that you are all familiar with. We are experiencing that in a big way in the United States too, and we have an election coming up very soon. So I want to refer you to the sense of identity from Stuart Hall, who led the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham. He had been influenced by someone who is a well-known name in India, Raymond Williams, the Marxist critic. He, in fact, when Raymond Williams died in 1988, Stuart Hall, who was of West Indian Black identity, he said that he had been the most powerful influence in his life. So Stuart Hall says that identity is neither simple nor stable. It's always a structure that is split. It has always ambivalence within it. Then he goes on to reconceptualize identity as something that happens over time, that is subject to the play of history and the play of difference. I want you to remember those words as you listen to the pages that I will read soon. What is he trying to say? Identity is contextual. Just to give you an example. A black person in Harlem is not the same as a black person in Mississippi. Whether you talk about that in today or whether you talked about it 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Those are two different identities. Once again, the tensions between Africans and African Americans are misperceptions between people who live in India and people who live abroad. And one of the things that I mentioned in the abstract is this idea of the double cross. It's easy for some friends of mine in India to tell me when I'm disagreeing with them over something, oh, why don't you mind your own business? Why don't you take care of what's going on in the United States? You no longer live here, right? On the other hand, we know that India receives billions of dollars in transactions, in foreign money wire transfers from people who live here to their families. And then, of course, our political parties do not hesitate to receive millions of dollars of donations from NRIs. So there is a understandable tension between those two ideas. We are okay with your money, but we are not okay with your views. The fact is that, as Salman Rushdie had said in his famous essay, Imaginary Homelands, we are always involved. We are always there. We are in the process of always creating and living in Indias of the mind that he calls. And it's not the reality that we left behind, but it is a reality that we create with our imagination. And that reality is not irrelevant to whatever is happening. So this tension between the homeland perception and perspectives and the diasporic percept is always there. And so in a way, I feel that people like me bear a double cross. We have to be involved. We have to be worried about both places. We would like to see something happen on 3rd of November, but we cannot completely forget things that are going on in India either. So I will move on with that. The diasporic population, especially the South Asian, but I'm talking mostly about Indian. It's a huge population. There are 31 million Indians who live outside India. I don't know if this includes the figure. This figure includes people who moved to Trinidad and Guyana and Jamaica in the 1830s as indentured labor. I'm not sure. And this is a question for us. Are African Americans who were forced to leave Africa as slaves, are they part of the African diaspora or not? Are people who were forced to, not forced, but kind of duped into signing indentured contracts, which the British government never maintained, from China and from India, are they part of the Indian diaspora or the Chinese diaspora or not? My view is more capacious. I would like to think that all of them are part of the diaspora. And so 31 million is a large number. That's almost the population of Canada. That's almost the double of Australia's population. And we are engaged in all kinds of thinking with reference to both two or more environments that we deal with. So while the earliest arrivals from Indian subcontinent in the United States can be traced back to 1790, they reached in Canada and United States in large enough numbers between 1890s and 1920s. And I won't go into the history, and US and Canada both found a way to exclude Asians. Some of you have heard about the Asian Exclusion Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882, but the Japanese and the Indians were also excluded. And all this was not addressed until 1965. The large number of people who are here now in the United States, more than 5 million people of Indian origin, that's because of the law that Lyndon Johnson passed in 1965. So, and that we have to remember, and often Indians here and Indians back home forget that happened at the same time as the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act between 1963 and 1965. While the earliest arrival from Indian subcontinent, we are getting that echo again. I hope that doesn't cause problem. I'm going to go on because we do need to move on. In any case, what I'm trying to say is that
it's not from our end, of course. I think it's clear absolutely from this end. You carry on, Professor.
Yeah. It's not from my end either. In any case, the point I'm making is that we have been the beneficiaries of the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. That Immigration Act of 1965 is a corollary to the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act passed by the same president. Moving on, the concept of diaspora in its multivalence and evolving uses continues to cause ripples in the studies of migration, culture, and identity. Like globalization in theory and practice, diaspora as a paradigm and its diverse realities clarifies ongoing individual and group experiences. It also has as a theoretical idea the ability, the capacity to bring much needed historical understanding of men and women who have been on the march throughout human history. Human beings have been on the march, Homo sapiens, all over. We were all born black, this may shock you, and we were all born in East Africa. So we have moved, the Homo sapiens have moved all over the world, and a lot of the different phenotypes of different looks, they come from selective, generational things and from climate experiences. Today, diaspora embraces the many globalized phenomena that continue to shape the economic realities in many parts of the world. The population also draws attention to the difficult and life-changing journeys that millions of migrants undertake. The vanishing borders shaped by technology, multinationals, and jet travel, some of which Aparna referenced, are counterbalanced by the reality of fences and borders. And so, there is a still kind of contradictory. I mean, you've heard that children were put in cages recently in the United States, and it's a pretty despicable thing that happened. Now, Dr. Field, who is going to speak to you, she published a book that is mentioned in her bio, Transforming Diaspora, in 2011. And actually, I must credit Robin for getting me started to think about these issues of diasporic realities. And in the introduction, Robin Field and Parmita Kapadia, they suggest that the role that the individual members and coalition play in and around a particular diaspora must take precedence over the concepts of place and homeland as the primary foundations of a diasporic community. Now, just think about things that change, because I indicated with Stuart Hall definition. Think about, for example, a gay person, right, of Indian background. They are caught between their comfort, their ethnic comfort with the South Asian community, right? But they also are aware of a lot of homophobic strains in culture at home and even in the diaspora communities. And there's a very well-known example, some of you probably heard her name, Urvashi Vaid, who was the leader of the lesbian and gay community here. At one point, she was counted among the 100 most important people in the United States. So when she realized that she was gay, she had a hard time telling her parents. Her father was a well-known Hindi writer, Krishan Baldev Vaid. And she says that I consciously adopted the hyphenated identity as an effort to rebuild my connection with my roots. I began to name myself Indian American to acknowledge the simultaneity of cultural assimilation and cultural difference that warred inside me, to begin to face how I was not assimilated and why I was. So LBGT and queer studies scholars have demonstrated in divergent ways how the very experience of diaspora is profoundly shaped by sexuality and influences the shimmering mobility of individuals between diaspora communities. So that's one example. I'm going to move on. I already mentioned Salman Rushdie's essay, but there's another element. For example, a lot of things that diasporic people do, which may seem very strange to people at home, have to do with their experience arriving in the new place and learning to, get adjusted, to cope with things. There are all kinds of insults and assaults that are we experience. We don't experience the level of racism that is directed at African Americans, but we do experience racism and discrimination. And diasporic individuals then take shelter in homeland, resources, memories. If someone who was a bank manager, I know many examples like that, who becomes a taxi driver. Now people think, oh, going to America, going to Canada, what a great thing. But you have to consider the fall in a person's sense of dignity and status that is involved. And so they then start latching on to some homeland practices, homeland ideologies. For example, a lot of Indians in this country They live here for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and they never form any friendships with the non-Indian peoples. This is true even today, although less and less. So you are happy with, getting together with Indian friends, watching Hindi videos, eating bhel puri, chicken curry, and talking about India, talking about Hindi films, and other things that we Indians like to do. So that is a problem that some diasporic individuals overcome by connecting with the histories of the countries they come to. If you remain separate from and understanding what blacks went through, what white immigrants from Europe went through, what Chinese immigrant went through, what happened to Native Americans. Because if you learn about that, that gives you a knowledge. And then also the traditions of descent that were very strong, for example, in the United States. People like Du Bois and Jose Marti, Randolph Bourne. These were radical thinkers who were pushing back against some of the not so nice realities of American life. So moving on, because we have a time issue, I want to mention that often refugee populations, they are diasporic. Palestinians, right, in many countries in the Middle East and in other parts of the world, Cubans, Vietnamese, Hmong, people from the Republic of Congo, all this. And then, another issue comes up, for example, in the field, since most of the listeners are academics, the field of Asian American studies has been dominated by the Chinese and the Koreans. Filipinos and the Indians do not get much attention in it, and things have changed recently. Scholars have pushed back, and some Chinese American scholars have been very helpful in bringing some balance to it. Clearly, that kind of rejection also pushes people into homeland ideologies. I do not have to remind you of the 50,000 people who gathered in Houston, the Howdy program, where the Prime Minister of India and the President of the United States, spoke to one of the largest crowds that was addressed by. Now, Robin will address some of the issues on feminism. So I did have a paragraph I'm going to skip on. I've already mentioned Rushdie. In the same essay, Rushdie refers to his models, and I'm going to quote quickly. He says, writers and politicians are natural rivals. Very important. And the novel is the one way of defying the official politicians' versions of the truth. And he acknowledges the influence of Richard Wright, the black writer. He mentions Ralph Ellison too. And by the way, some of you know that Richard Wright, the book Native Son, is primarily responsible for my entry into African American studies, something that I have been doing and enjoying and learning from for the last 50 years. So I'm again moving on. So the point that one is made that things are always kind of in flux. This idea that India has a particular identity, or the United States has a particular identity, is really a false notion. Indian identity, even though we are a very ancient civilization, and American identity, even though America is a much more recent phenomena, it is always under pressure to change. I mean, just think about giving you a very simple example from United States. How much has changed in the United States? I mean, blacks were brought as slaves. Civil War was fought in 1860s. They were given freedom rights. Those freedom rights were taken away from them by a political maneuver in 1877. There was a disputed election. They had to fight for that again 100 years later with Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. So any idea that, America was this or that in the 19th century and we need to go back to the good old days, right? Whether the good days are promised for the future that we are waiting for, or the good days existed in ancient India. That's really not a very viable concept when you relate it to the realities of, and I'll mention the example of Nepal. A lot of people identify with Nepal because, he was an Indian, he was a diasporic Indian, is from Trinidad, and we took a great deal of pride, and there's a lot of empathy in his novel, his autobiographical novel, The House for Mr. Biswas. But other than that, when he wrote 3 books about India, which most of you know, Area of Darkness, 1964, India, a Wounded Civilization, India, a Million Mutinies Now. You see, first of all, he gets very offended that people don't recognize that he's British, right? In the first book. The second book, he is declaring us a retarded civilization, a wounded civilization, using some concept from Sudhir Kakkar and R.K. Narayan. In the third one, he pretty much goes whole hog with the people who destroyed Babri Masjid. He's thought that was a moment to celebrate. On the other hand, diasporic writers in India, in US and Canada, people like Sadhu Singh Dhami, who was a scientist who wrote an autobiographical book called Meluka, Dhan Gopal Mukherjee, Caste and Outcast, Dalip Singh Sond, who became a congressman. The first Asian congressman in the US Congress was a Sikh. You may not know that. It was not a Chinese, and it was not a Korean, it was a Sikh. And Nehru invited him. He addressed the 2 houses of parliament as if he was a head of a government. So they all have recognized the unstable categories. So I talked also already about the double responsibility, and I mentioned Jasmine. Of course, Jasmine is not the only model. If you will recall, Jasmine comes from Punjab, and Bharti Mukherjee's descriptions of Punjab are extremely stereotypical. She was capable of doing a more authentic representation, which she does with the state of Iowa, going into very intricate details about the life there. And then, of course, it suggested that women in India do not have any agency, that Punjabi parents would not allow a young woman to go to medical college, which is completely contrary to realities that we know. I mean, there are a lot of bad things about Punjabi, especially the female infanticide. But I think it's otherwise one of the more progressive areas of South Asia. But you have Rohinton Mistry, Fine Balance, Amitav Ghosh, Shadow Lines, Sarah Soleri from Pakistan, Meatless Days, Meena Alexander, Aga Shahid Ali from Kashmir. They represent different models of doing it. It's not that there is some kind of a uniformity that all South Asian writers in Canada or US deal with these issues in the same way. Then again, I'm giving you some kind of images. For example, in India and among Indian Americans, South Asian Americans in the North America, people will say, this brings home the point quickly in this way, instead of my reading the whole paragraph. Oh, she married an American. You've heard this, right? And what they mean is that she married a white American. When they say an American, they never mean a Black American. They never mean a Hispanic American. They never mean a Chinese American. And they don't refer to themselves as American. I believe that I am both Indian and American. I find no conflict straddling that double identity. I was born in India. I was shaped by India. I love India, and I'm going to remain India to the end of my days. On the other hand, I'm very involved in what's going on here, especially having immersed myself early in my life at age 23, 24 in African American studies. That gave me actually a place to park myself in. I have never particularly felt alienated in America as many immigrants and many scholars do. So then, I talk about the notion of whiteness. This is a huge issue now, whiteness studies. And South Asians cannot become white, right? They cannot become white like Irish Americans, Italian Americans. There's a wonderful, the whole field of critical race theory that deals with it. But what do? We would move from cities to suburbs, and we would want to hang out only with white people. We very rarely make the attempt to connect with Black human beings or Hispanic human beings or Native American human beings. And we become white in terms of our practices, our values, our attitudes, even though we cannot entirely become white in terms of our phenotype, in terms of our skin color. So then I have a final point, how both in China and in India, there's a particular kind of majoritarian view. For example, in an essay that is included in Robin Field's edited book, Chinese American scholar Xu Mei Shi, she says that how, for example, the Chinese people have given importance to the majority community, the Chinese identities based on that. And we see similar attempts in India to create a particular kind of majoritarian ideology, and then expecting people in the diaspora to identify with, because that is placed, that's given a. So finally, I'll just conclude by going back to the point that I made earlier, that you have this double cross, you have this double identity, and people cannot, despite some breezy narratives of Bharti Mukherjee or Dinesh or D'Souza or others, you cannot easily absolve yourself of what you bring here. We expect our presence in North America or in UK or anywhere also to change this society. See, if you are sitting around a table, and you can call it multicultural, but if the center of the core of the reality doesn't change, then your being a ethnic American is of no consequence. So, and this change that we bring has to go beyond Indian food becoming popular. There have to be certain paradigms, there have to be certain attitudes that can influence the larger American life. And I think it is happening. In Canada, the South Asians are a huge presence. Partly it's because they're a much smaller country. I mean, just imagine there are 7 or 8 South Asian people in the cabinet, including 4 or 5 Sikhs. The Indian cabinet in Delhi doesn't have more than 1 or 2 Sikhs, but in Canada there are 5 or 6 Sikhs. In United States, because it's a much larger country, that impact is not immediately seen. But just look at the number of people who are getting becoming members of Congress, running for positions in the cities, in the counties. becoming judges. So gradually, we are becoming a visible, we are still a very small minority, which means that we have to work with other minorities. We have to find a way to form a coalition with other Asian Americans. We have to form a way of forming a coalition with the Black Americans when issues are the same. And because if you are a relatively small minority, you cannot get your agenda pushed unless you form coalitions. African Americans are about 14% of the US population, about the same percentage that Muslims in India are. Hispanics are of different backgrounds, about 17%. Those are the large minorities. And there is a distinction between large minorities and small minorities, both in India and the United States. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Singh, for that very, very illuminating talk of yours. And it really set the tone of this webinar rolling. Palimpsest or disjuncture, the diasporic dilemma in North America. Professor Singh's talk concerned itself largely on how diasporic individuals confront challenges of violation, violence, environment, and so on, whether or not the various modes of writing are compatible or available to meet up to those challenges. He took a broad overview of the writings, ranging from the Indian diasporic writings to African American writing, and so it was really illuminating. Thank you for that wonderful talk, Professor Singh. May I now invite our second panelist and speaker of the day, Professor Robin Field. Professor Field is a professor of English at King's College in Pennsylvania, USA. She has co-edited a very important and remarkable essay collection titled Transforming Diaspora, Communities Beyond National Boundaries, which features an afterword by Professor Amritjeet Singh. She has her new book, Writing the Survivor, the rape novel in late 20th century American fiction, was published by Clemson University Press in the US and Liverpool University Press in the UK in 2020. Besides this, she has earned numerous publications to her credit. She is one of those spirited, amicable, resolved, layered, and profound individual I personally feel possessing this rare, admirable ease and grace to help you pull through a difficult situation. And perhaps that's what earmarks her and her scholarly pursuits. May I call Professor Robin Field for her presentation, please.
Thank you so very much for that warm and generous introduction. I am so grateful to be here with you all in what is morning in Pennsylvania in the United States on the East Coast. I, as Professor Aparna mentioned, edited the book along with Parmita Kapadia from Northern Kentucky University, Transforming Diaspora, Communities Beyond National Boundaries. And it's a collection of essays that interrogates traditional definitions of diaspora. I'm glad that Amrit was able to reference another one of the essays in that collection on the Chinese diaspora by Shumei Singh. And I hope that if the book isn't already available in your library, that you'll consider requesting it and looking at the other remarkable essays and Dr. Singh's afterword as well. So my talk today will take on the shifting contours of diaspora in the 21st century. I will examine how globalization and intersectionality informs feminism and women's experiences as diasporic citizens. While women's experiences have always been unique, the diasporic experience provides multiple challenges for the ideas of assimilation, acculturation, and the maintenance of traditions, the formation of a personal identity, and the idea of home. To illuminate these complexities, I will examine fiction by three very well-known South Asian diasporic women who live in the United States, first Bharti Mukherjee and Chitra Divakaruni, and then I will discuss the much feted author Jhumpa Lahiri and a lesser known author named Meena Arora Nayak, who I hope you all will look into, especially her novel I reference in this talk called Endless Rain, which is about Kashmir. So first, I'm going to review our traditional understanding of diaspora and argue why in our collection, Dr. Kapadia and I believe that place or homeland are no longer the key characteristics of diaspora, as Dr. Singh mentioned. And instead, culture, cultural exchange, and interdependence based on travel, communication, and the free flow of information, entertainment, and goods allow the diasporic experience to manifest in exciting and energizing ways. I then briefly discussed the works by Mukherjee, Divakaruni, Lahiri, and Nayak to show how women's lives exemplify this contemporary diasporic condition. So traditional understandings of the diasporic condition demand fealty to place. Indeed, the political scientist Walker Connor defines diaspora as a dispersal of people from their homeland, and clearly the Jewish diaspora is the exemplar of such loyalty to geography. Expelled from their origins in Palestine, these exiled communities establish both memory of and allegiance to place of Genesis. To return to a geography and thus imbue it with cultural, ethnic, religious, and historical significance was the hallmark of the traditional diasporic condition. And place is at the forefront of William Safran's understanding of diaspora. In his article from the inaugural issue of the journal Diaspora, his essay, Diasporas in Modern Societies, Myth of Homeland and Return, Safran delineates a now oft-cited definition of the classical model of diaspora, and he names 6 key characteristics. First, the members of a diasporic community have been dispersed from a geographical center to 2 or more peripheral locations. Often this center is referred to as the homelands and the periphery as the host lands. Secondly, diasporans maintain a collective memory, vision, or myth about their original homeland. Kim D. Butler expands upon this point saliently to note that this element of consciously held and constructed identity has been pivotal to their survival as a cultural unit. Thirdly, they feel some sense of alienation from the host society and believe they cannot be fully integrated into it. Fourthly, they believe that their ancestral home is their true ideal home and the place to which they or their descendants would or should eventually return when conditions are appropriate. Fifthly, the diasporic community believes it should commit itself to the maintenance or restoration, as well as the safety and prosperity of the original homeland. Such devotion to the homeland underscores the importance of place noted previously. Finally, each diasporic citizen continues to relate personally or vicariously to that homeland in one way or another. And their ethno-communal consciousness and solidarity are importantly defined by the existence of such a relationship. And Safran makes another crucial distinction, which does not appear in his list of 6 diasporic characteristics, and that is that diasporic consciousness is an intellectualization of an existential condition. And so Dr. Kapadia and I believe that this intellectualization is the very thing that allows diasporas to flourish. Yet such loyalty to place that is demanded by Safran's definition proves problematic to understanding the myriad manifestations of diaspora. And of course, the Indian diaspora provides an apt example of these difficulties, in particular, because of many of its dispersed people have moved multiple times, as Dr. Singh noted previously. In his essay, Global Indian Diasporas, Exploring Trajectories of Migration and Theory, Gijbert Unk describes these migrants like this. They include Indian indentured laborers in Suriname who eventually settled in the Netherlands, or those who were expelled from East Africa and ended up settling in the UK and Canada. They left their host countries for political rather than economic reasons. However, interestingly enough, most of them never considered remigrating to India. They may have felt some cultural ties with the so-called motherland, but the economic, political, and family ties sent them elsewhere. So these multiple migrants often did retain elements of Indian culture in their daily lives, and I acknowledge that this term is very generic and homogenizing. And while these migrants may have found their cultural connections to India integral in their consciousness formation, they neither hoped nor intended to return to India. Therefore, the centrality of place, in this example, the geography of the subcontinent, is disputable for these seemingly diasporic citizens. Yet it is still compelling to term them diasporic, despite their lack of interest in a return to the homeland, or even an overt connection to or ongoing concern for this place. Instead, the memory or myth of the place of origin is more potent than the place itself. The intellectualization thus suffices to create this distinctive cultural identity that still may be termed diasporic. Another difficulty in prioritizing place as inherently constitutive of diaspora arises when attempting to define place itself. Often, place as homeland is conflated with the geography of the nation state. Yet, as Paul Gilroy notes, diaspora identification exists outside of and sometimes in opposition to the political forms and codes of modern citizenship. Again, the Indian diaspora provides an excellent case in point. Within the nation state of India resides people of multiple religious, ethnic, and regional backgrounds. To offer the single nomenclature of the Indian diaspora for such a diverse array of people belies the complexity within this nation state and the subcontinent itself. Indeed, those dispersed Indians appear less interested in maintaining a collective memory of the nation state, instead turning to other cultural markers to create ethno-consciousness and solidarity. Ankh writes, Indians abroad do not so much identify with India as a nation, but with the homeland, that is, the specific region where the migrants or their descendants come from. They often refer to themselves as Bengalis, Gujaratis, Telugus, or to their specific subcastes, such as Patels, Lohanas, and Kuchis. Clearly, members of this diaspora typically identify with one of the many locales within the nation state, rather than the nation state itself as homeland. And this, of course, is not true in every single case. Of course, more and more recently, within the past decade, the homeland has been the focus of NRI attention because of political situation in India. But the difficulties of prioritizing the nation state of India as the marker of a unified diasporic people are readily apparent. Consequently, the idea that place is both the formative and definitive characteristic of diaspora is fraught as well. So given that place is so fraught, it is clear that culture, and a mutable, evolving culture, no less, is as greatly or even more determinate to individual and communal identity than place or homeland. The traditional diasporic reverence of a particular soil or space has been supplanted by a more multivalent sense of identity, community, and belonging. Diaspora now signifies a richer, more complex understanding of displacement and dispersal of peoples. Dr. Kapadia and I, in our book, propose an understanding of diaspora that makes culture central, its formation, transformation, multiplicity, and complexity, rather than place. While revisiting Safran's characteristics, we embrace his second and fifth tenets for their juxtaposition of community with culture. Safran's notion that memory, vision, or myth that is shared by a people allows for greater flexibility in identifying a diasporic community. It also allows the community itself greater agency in creating and understanding its own ethno-consciousness and solidarity. And again, we would stress the importance of the intellectualization of the existential condition of diaspora. So today's diasporas must be understood as a type of consciousness that emphasizes the variety of experiences, a state of mind, and a sense of identity. Thus, equally valid as the cultural practices and collective myths of a diasporic community are the psychological, intangible, and personal constructions of an individual within that community. While diaspora's genesis lies within community, it also depends upon and draws creative force from individual imaginations of its members. And this is why literature is such a key aspect of diaspora. The cultural work of individuals, of writers, should be treated with the same respect as the communal ties that bind these individuals together. Clearly, resituating diaspora within a cultural rather than geographic frame productively subordinates the traditional binary of homeland and hostland. In addition, such a positioning demonstrates the inherent connections diaspora has with both globalization and transnationalism. And while borders are very real for many migrants, especially now that, for example, I cannot leave the United States, let alone the area I live in, without scrutiny, we posit, Kapadia and I, that globalization and transnationalism are fundamental forces that engender diaspora as opposed to place, especially place that is coterminous with the nation state. So Paul Gilroy describes how the nation state is antithetical to diaspora and its many invigorating possibilities for diverse, dispersed peoples. He writes, "The nation state has regularly been presented as the institutional means to terminate diaspora, dispersal at one end through assimilation and at the other through return. In either guise, the nation state brings the distinctive temporarily of diasporic life to an abrupt end." So, in contrast to the limitations placed by the nation state, globalization and transnationalism allow for new forms of diaspora to emerge and thrive without the restriction of place or temporality. I'm going to move quickly through the ideas about globalization that Dr. Kapadia and I discussed in our book's introduction. I want to stress about globalization, though, a quote from Jonathan Xavier Inda and Renato Rosaldo. And they say, "The process of globalization is much too complex to be thought of as merely a westernizing affair, for it involves not just the circulation of Western subjects and objects, but also the dissemination of non-Western forms. Globalization, in other words, cannot be conceived solely as a matter of one-way Western imperialism." So this takes us back to what Dr. Singh was saying about how the center is affected by the margins and the margins are affected by the center. And those terms probably give unequal weight at this point in time that we should be aware of. Dr. Aparna also pointed out how communication has allowed the individual voices to affect national and international discourse. So the fact that we're on Zoom today, I and Dr. Singh from the US to you in Hyderabad, demonstrate how our cultures are talking to each other, and without these technologies and these conversations and these creative imaginings of homeland and culture, we would staying stuck in this idea that place is the key element, as opposed to our modern technologies, communications, and imaginations. So I'm going to move forward in the work to talk briefly about intersectionality and how this key concept needs to inform our understanding of diasporic women's experiences. So as Dr. Singh mentioned, we cannot flatten or homogenize our understanding of identity, and intersectionality helps us understand that quite well. This term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, it tells us that social categorizations such as race and class and gender are always interconnected. We cannot focus upon one category of identity without considering how these other aspects overlap and confer privilege or discrimination. So in looking at some specific texts next, it is critical for us to realize that the diasporic women portrayed experience their lives differently because of being diasporans, but also because of other factors, specifically trauma, generational status, socioeconomic status, and religion. So let me turn now to the text that I'd like to talk about specifically. First, I'm going to talk about Bharti Mukherjee's novel, Jasmine. And Dr. Singh, of course, he and I have big fights about this novel. He likes to criticize it, and I, of course, like to criticize it, but I also like to celebrate what it can accomplish in talking about India and America and the formation of identity. So interestingly, Mukherjee herself, the author, was very vociferous about this is an American novel. It's not Indian American, South Asian American, or post-colonial writing. It is about being American. And even the blurb on the cover of my edition from the New York Times Book Review says, one of the most suggestive novels we have about what it is to become an American. So because of connections within the tropes of American literature, it's too easy to consider the protagonist as an immigrant who is able to quickly assimilate into American culture. I'm going to assume that many of you know the plot trajectory here, and so I can reference some moments without giving too much explanation. But in sum, she leaves her village in Punjab. Her husband, whom she marries at 14, changes her name from Jyoti to Jasmine so that she will become a modern Indian woman. And after his murder, she travels to America and changes her name multiple times, becoming Jazzy, Jace, and Jane as she moves from Florida to New York City to Iowa. And at the end of the novel, as she's ready to leave Iowa and her life as Jane, we hear her thinking, I realize I have already stopped thinking of myself as Jane. Adventure, risk, transformation. The frontier is pushing indoors through uncaulked windows. And I refer to the protagonist here on out as J because all of her names thus far were beginning with J. And so in all likelihood, she'll take on a new name in California, her next destination. So this genesis of the Americanness of the protagonist has often been located by critics in the scenes of rape and murder that occur when Jay reaches Florida after having traveled the zigzag route from India through several continents. She is raped by the captain of the trawler who brings her and 3 other undocumented persons into the United States. And so I argue in my new book, which came out this year, Writing the Survivor, that the trauma of rape is the reason that Jay is constantly moving from place to place and from identity to identity, that she suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, and that spurs her moves from Florida to New York to Iowa to California. But we can also look further into her past to see another traumatic event that affected her and her family, which is the partition of the subcontinent in 1947. And so I've argued elsewhere that the partition trauma shadows all of the major events in this novel, and not to acknowledge this legacy of violence leads to the novel's prioritization as American rather than transnational and diasporic South Asian literature. So I rely upon Marianne Hirsch's ideas about post-memory in regard to the Holocaust, because post-memory explains how members of the post-generation, or the generation who lived after a trauma, themselves experience a kind of remembering through the stories, images, and behaviors among which they grew up. So though Jasmine does not experience partition herself, her parents do, and her parents constantly remind her of their life in Lahore and what could have been. Her father in particular, we hear, let's see, the novel even opens with her framing her birth in relation to partition, saying, I was born 18 years after the partition riots. And her mother's remembrances are described like this. Mataji, my mother, couldn't forget the partition riots. Muslims sacked our house. Neighbors' servants tugged off earrings and bangles, defiled grottos, sabered my grandfather's horse. Life shouldn't have turned out that way. I've never been to Lahore, but the loss survives in the instant replay of family story. Forever Lahore smokes. Forever my parents flee. So the timelessness of this final line underscores the trauma that this family lived through. And so, although Jasmine critiques her father's longing for his past life, she ends up replicating his inability to be satisfied in the present, both in her childhood in India and in her adulthood in the United States. And so I would argue, and this could be a whole 30 minutes in itself, that trauma is a key characteristic that determines Jasmine's experience as a diasporan citizen. She cannot leave her past behind because of living through her husband's murder, because of rape, because of partition trauma. And as much as she seems to be breezily assimilating into American culture, she is not, in fact, leaving her past behind. So from the intersectional approach, we see that trauma is a key characteristic for diaspora as well. Moving on to Chitra Divakaruni's story, Mrs. Dutta Writes a Letter, which was published in '98 in a magazine called Atlantic Monthly, and in her second short story collection. This story nicely illustrates the concept that Inda and Rosaldo argued, that globalization is not a one-way Western imperialism. So upon first glance, the plot of this story does seem to confirm a traditional understanding of diasporans longing to return to the homeland, as the widow, Mrs. Dutta, deeply misses Kolkata after moving to California to live with her son and his family. And she is internally narrating her responses to American life to her good friend back in India, Mrs. Basu, where she's planning to write a letter where she offers an idealized version of her life as the respected elder in the house. The truth is a lot more complicated in that her son doesn't pay much attention to her. Her daughter-in-law, Shamali, also born in India, doesn't give her respect and deference that she expects and that she gave to her own mother-in-law years before. And her grandchildren are uninterested about learning traditional ideas like the Ramayana or learning about life in India. And while Mrs. Dutta is congratulating herself on adapting to life in America, she learns that her daughter-in-law is threatening to move out of the house with the children because she is so upset about her mother-in-law's presence and disruption to the house. So the family living in California, the Indian-born parents, American-born children, have a very tenuous connection to India at this point, and the presence of the grandmother who could shore up this cultural connection is seen negatively rather than positively. So there's no maintenance and preservation of homeland, and Mrs. Dutta is eventually unwelcome in the house. Now, Diva Karuni complicates this ending, though, by having Mrs. Dutta write a letter, as the title notes, and as she is going to perform the return to the homeland, she is going, in fact, changing her own ideas about family that she had held so strongly. So she wanted to be needed by her son. She wanted to receive the respect from her family. And now she's understanding that instead she needs to give her family space, privacy, and independence. And her new way of being will prioritize her relationship with her friend, her peer, and her own independence. And so her experience as a member of the elder generation, and this is the intersectional idea here, is equally marked by the fact that she is of this older generation as it is that she was living within the diaspora. And it also demonstrates that her diasporic experience shows how the denizens of the homeland are influenced by diasporans abroad as well. She is returning to India with a new way of thinking about who she can be as a widow, as an independent woman now, rather than somebody who is deeply enmeshed within the family unit. So I'm going to conclude by very briefly talking about Jhumpa Lahiri and Meena Arora Nayak. We all know Jhumpa Lahiri's novel, The Namesake, and how it ends with Ashima Ganguly planning to sell her house to then live 6 months of the year in India and 6 months in America. And she's going to divide her time in America between her son and her daughter and her friends. She's an American citizen now, and she does not wish to return permanently to India. She'll only live 6 months of the year there. Lahiri writes of Ashima, true to the meaning of her name, she will be without borders, without a home of her own, a resident of everywhere and nowhere. Ashima's privileged socioeconomic status allows her this movement, and there's our connection to intersectionality. We can't look at her diasporic movement without recognizing the financial privilege that allows her that movement. And like Mrs. Dutta, Ashima forges a new path as a widow. Her children also do not experience the diasporic longing for the homeland or the desire to maintain cultural fealty to traditions from their parents' generation. Her daughter Sonia is marrying Ben, who is half Chinese and half Jewish. And it's interesting to think about Sonia and Ben's children and how multiple cultural heritages will play out. Will there be an end point to diasporic culture because of the intersection of so many cultures? Or does it turn into an extreme chutneyfication of a cultural heritage instead? So turning to Nayak's novel, the one that perhaps you don't know as well as these other texts, it's called Endless Rain. It's set in Kashmir. And there is a character there named Jamila, who is a Kashmiri Muslim woman, and she leaves to go to college in the United States. And she ends up living there after marrying a white American man. And like Amrit, I agree that Americans often are coded as white, but I think it's important to say white American because to encourage the realization that Americans come in all racial and ethnic backgrounds. So Nayak's description of Jamila's intelligence and potential for becoming a strong leader underscores the tragedy that there's no place for her in Kashmir of the 1990s. Yet Nayak's periodic references to Jamila during the most violent and fraught moments of the novel remind us that this Kashmiri woman could return one day and help to improve the political situation and lives of ordinary citizens. Jamila could bring resources back from the host land to the homeland, as Ruben Patterson notes in regard to Diaspora's strategic transnationalism. Jamila's situation also reminds us of how marginalization is place-based as well. She's not marginalized in America for the most part, but she would be in Kashmir at that moment as a Muslim woman. So I hope many of you will pick up this novel, Endless Rain, to see how it challenges readers to imagine how diasporans could return to enact positive change to the homeland. So I thank you for the opportunity to share these ideas with you, and I look forward to questions and conversation at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Robin Field, for that very refined and consequential talk that widely amplified the uniqueness of women's experiences and how diasporic experiences really challenge the very tropes around which the concept of diaspora is, largely moves, such as acculturation, assimilation, identity formulation, referring to Marion Hirsch and later, of course, Kimberly Cranshaw's term of how intersectionality helps us to understand women's experiences in diaspora and how they offer a decentering approach to this diasporic displacement. They show how contemporary identities are reconfigured, referring to Bharti Mukherjee, Jhumpa Lahiri, Chitra Banerjee Devakaruni, and Meena Arora. Thank you for that wonderful talk. And I'm sure those hundreds of people and participants watching you on YouTube Live would greatly benefit from your very, very illuminating lecture today. Thank you once again. May I just make a quick announcement? Questions have to be typed in the chat box. That applies to both the Zoom link viewers and the YouTube channel viewers. Your questions will be taken at the end of all the talks. There's a special question answer session that has been kept for interventions and questions. We'll move on to our next distinguished speaker for the day, Professor Anisur Rahman, a critic, translator, poet, and a friend. Professor Anisur Rahman was formerly a professor at Jamia Millia. And lovers of refined poetry, refined Urdu poetry particularly, cannot fail to miss his name because he's also a senior advisor to Rekhta Foundation, which happens to be the world's largest website for promoting Urdu language, literature, and culture. He's an extensively published and reputed scholar in the area of comparative translation, post-colonial, diaspora, and has numerous edited collections and volumes to his share. He's been a Shastri Fellow at the University of Alberta, visiting scholar at Purdue University, and may I very humbly add, a distinguished speaker now at EFL University today. A very warm and cordial person of genial disposition. He's better known for his well-crafted, contained, well-formulated, disciplined, precise, and shown of complex theoretical jargon kind of talks. So let's hear him out. I have circulated the bio sketches of all the participants to of all the panelists to all the thousands of people who are watching us live. So I won't go detail into the collections, though I might say, Anisur Rahman Saab, that Hazaro Khwaishein Aisi Hai, which, aisi hai ki I want to keep talking about your collections, I want to keep speaking about your works, but I'll halt myself there. And Hazaro Khwaishein is also one of Professor Rahman's story collection. So may I call upon Professor Rahman to deliver his talk.
Very many talks, very many thanks, Aparna. The most embarrassing moment in a conference is when you are introduced. And one shakes because one doesn't really know what's going to be told about you. But then, thank you very much for the kind words that we have spoken just a while ago. Let me first say good morning to everyone for whom there is a morning. and that is Professor Amritjeet Singh and Professor Robin Field. And good evening to all the friends from India and elsewhere. I have to thank first FLU and the Department of Literary Studies and Dr. Aparna Lanjivar Bose, my old acquaintance from Mumbai University, 10 years or 15 years ago, I don't remember exactly. And then her colleagues and students who made it possible for us to meet today, this evening. Friends, I have proposed in the title of my talk today, and there is a question that I have proposed. Does diaspora write from the margins? Now, in order to be able to answer that question, which I have posed at the very beginning of my talk and the title, I thought that I should better be talking about the marginality and centrality to be able to arrive to my answer, and about power and powerlessness, about diaspora and home. Very briefly, all these I'll be touching about loss and gain of identity, which Amrit also spoke a while ago, and about diasporic imagination, which is the other reference of my title, as you have seen already. Friends, let me begin by talking a little bit very briefly, and these are some of the issues that you have already been acquainted with, and that is the margin and the center, the centrality and the marginality. We have talked lots about it in the classrooms and otherwise as well. But just to recapitulate, in order to be able to create a context for what I want to posit today, just very briefly, I would like to mention all those points so that you can just recapitulate in your own minds and be able to relate with the question or the thesis that I want to propose today. Margin as a very relative term, as is this word called center. Both are very relative terms. They are always contextual. One of the observations which I saw in the text in the chat box was that it is always relative. Yes, it's very true. It's very relative. Margin and center are literal and can be used literally. They can be used in a political context. They can be used in economic context. They can be used spatially, and they can be used in geographical terms as well. So when you say that, say you look, you open a page, the printed page, and you see the margin for all the sides and all the 4 sides, that too is a margin. That's very literal meaning of that. But when you think in political terms, one loses an election or one wins an election by a short margin or a big margin, narrow margin or a big margin. That too is a margin. That is a different meaning of margin. Then there is a margin of loss in a business. Then there is a margin of gain in the business. That can also be very huge loss and a very huge gain, and the huge margin and the very small margin. Similarly, in geographical terms, you can say that you are far removed from the center, and that is from the main body of a location. So you are talking it in geographical terms. So there are many ways of looking at this margin, but just to sum it up, could I just propose that margin is also synonymous with what you call edge, or limit, or boundary, or brink, or periphery. I stop there. These are all synonymous words that go with margin, and these are used very closely used by the critics and by the students when they look at the diasporic literature. So these are the used words that they bring together to be able to understand a text, of which some references have been made by Professor Robin and Professor Amritjeet Singh also. But I would like to draw your attention to another fact, that margin also means something else. For example, it refers to it refers to surplus as well. It qualifies surplus. It qualifies allowance. It stands for something which is extra space, or some elbow room. So margin is used in both the ways, and in both the ways you can look at it, especially when you look at a literary text. It is used, generally speaking, as the students, when we approach a diaspora author or diaspora text, it is used generally as an antonym of the center. This margin is usually taken as an antonym of the center. And it refers to someone who feel that they are not important and they cannot make any influence, or cannot influence any kind of an event to happen. So that is one marginal person, or that margin that we refer to. Marginality basically refers to positionality. You take a position and you become marginal, and whether a diasporic writer writes from that margin, that I will come to later when I finish. So marginal groups do not necessarily endorse the notion of a fixed center. There is a center margin equation that operates all the time, but in a very, very complex manner. If you were to look at a literary text, and if you look at the history of the people who have been the marginal people and the people who have been at the center, and how their relationship has been growing through ages and through time and through place. So what caused this debate, this margin-center relationship came into debate, especially when the post-colonial studies started. And when, along with that, the diaspora studies also started in the universities, and the students started working and researching on this. It is also because of the secondly, it is also because of the advent of a democratic world order that you started talking of the post-coloniality as well as of the center and the margin. There is no time to devote on that and to explain it further. We all understand what I mean. Margin and center also creates a binary, and this can very easily be looked at when you refer to a literary text. That is, there is a center and which also takes into consideration a periphery. There is a majority which takes into consideration a minority. So these are the binaries it creates. There is a settler and the settled binary. There is the West and the East binary. There is the native and the diasporic binary. There is the colonial and the post-colonial binary. There is the privileged and the underprivileged binary. There is the first world and the third world binary, and so on and so forth. It goes on. I just said in the beginning that I'll just be referring to these because we'll not be able to go, because we all know these are the issues that we have been discussing day in, day out. Margin center also brings other issues for our consideration, brings before us some other issues also for consideration. For example, it takes into consideration the question of place and displacement. Now, this is not only in the diaspora studies that we think of place and displacement. It is the major issue in post-colonial studies and theory as well. It talks of here and there, of home at home and home abroad. That is home here and the home somewhere else where one has shifted and one has chosen to live, and it's a decision taken with caution. It also creates a kind of other issue that is related with the past and the present, memory, etc. That has been just referred to. Then it refers to universality and difference. I need not explain all these. It also refers to representation and to resistance that you can see in the text. It refers to nationalism and to hybridism as well. And most importantly, it refers to the new canons as opposed to one canon. It refers to new myths as opposed to one myth. And it refers to new histories as opposed to several histories, or as opposed to one history. So diaspora takes into consideration, or the students of diaspora try to engage with these considerations, or the literary texts that I have read and taught. I've been able to look at this from this perspective, that there is oneness on the other hand, and there's diversity on the other hand, and there is a negotiation all the time going between the texts and the readers that you lay your hands upon. This also brings us to another question of power and powerlessness. As I mentioned in the beginning, power, is the ability, is something that you can, it refers to a skill, it refers to your capacity, it refers to potency. Now, it implies control over the resources, it implies political control, it implies manipulation, it implies persuasion. So that is how power works, and those who don't have this become powerless and become subjects. All very clear, we understand all this. So it's a primary feature of post-colonial discourse. So I'm trying to relate diaspora with post-colonial questions that we often engage with. So diaspora cannot be separated as such from the post-coloniality or the post-colonial questions that we often refer to while teaching or while reading a post-colonial text and otherwise. So diaspora is very closely related to the post-colonial issues. That is one point I wanted to make. Intentionality is the major force behind the concept of power. There's an intention behind, and this is very clearly writ large in the text that we often engage with. You have referred to some of the novels. I've been a student of poetry, and I can also find this happening there in a very clear, not in such a clear manner it happens in the novel, because a novel is sometimes one-to-one correspondence, but poetry talks through metaphors and through symbols and creates its own myth. So it doesn't appear in poetry in that manner, but this feature of the post-colonial discourse is also very clearly seen in the poetry as well. So this effectiveness is achieved through the apparatus of the estate, and how the estate in a diaspora location functions, and how this estate in the home, or the home from where you have gone to a position, to a place in which you have adopted and which you have chosen to live finally, and you have tried to negotiate with. So this question also comes into consideration. It leads to counter discourses. Lots of discourses come because of it. Displacement is one of the major discourses that it brings forth before us to engage with. It also brings the difference and the universality issue. It brings the resistance and the representation issue before us. This whole diasporic business, post-colonialism and against colonialism, new canon against the old canon, new myths against the old myths, and new histories and historiographies against the old histories and the historiographies. These are the sum and total and the substance of what we often talk about the diaspora and the post-colonial, because I often take these two together, and it has helped me understand both post-colonial conditions as well as the diasporic text and diasporic condition together. We have had a long history of diaspora. Professor Singh was just mentioning, I need not go into the details, but it's a very long history. That Indian diaspora may be traced back to the 19th century. It begins with indentured laborers, 1833-34 onwards, and indentured labor to Mauritius, to Caribbean, to Trinidad, Tobago, Guyana, South Africa, Fiji, etc. Then the Indian plantation laborers, island, Martinique and Suriname, then Angola, Mozambique, etc., etc. First the unskilled, then the skilled laborers, and then the writers and those who were career makers who wanted to reach a place where they had a great future. So there are layers in diaspora. Diaspora is not just one. There are many kinds of diasporas that you have. So it started from the indentured laborers to the more informed people who were going for a career, who were going to, the writers more especially that you are engaged with. So there are different kinds of diasporas that we have to engage with. Professionals or self-employed people I'm referring to. Now, 2 millions, for example, Amarjit was just saying that 30 million people the diaspora has. 20 years ago, when Government of India was trying to engage with this issue of how many Indians are there, so it was 20 million. Now, in 10 years, we have seen, 20 years, we have seen it has increased by 10 millions again. So you can look at the speed by which it is going up. We are aware that the Government of India set up a committee, high-level committee in September 2000 to prepare a detailed report on the Indian diaspora in different parts of the world and how this Indian diaspora was in a position to connect with home or was in a position to. The government wanted that they should connect with home. So there were many events held in that connection, and people came, and there were huge, in Delhi itself, I've seen this happening. So this continued for a while. There was an effort to connect with the people who have left their homes and created new homes and found new homes and new opportunities. So this was one kind of a governmental kind of engagement with to contain the diaspora itself. The features of diasporic imagination, because I'm also engaging with the diasporic imagination, what it actually means. It is based on personal memory. It is based on collective memory as well, the family and the culture that you inherit. But there is a sense of alienation, which you can see in all the poems that I have read or you have read, and the fiction especially that you have read. Belief in the ancestral land, the belief in the sanctity of the ancestral land, so to say, and a craving for identity. Identity has been talked about here. There are positive points of diaspora that we know about. Diaspora creates various nations of our Indianness. This is the point I wanted to make, basically, that diaspora creates the various notions of Indianness. It's not just one India that all Indians are representing wherever they go, either in North America or Canada or wherever you think of, or in other parts of Europe. So this Indian diaspora is a multi-religious diaspora, is a multicultural diaspora, is a multi-ethnic diaspora, is a multilingual diaspora. It's a great variety and a very rich variety. And among these, you have the writers from various positions. They're from various religions, they're from various locations in India, from various cultural backgrounds in India, and they write different kinds of texts. So diaspora text is not just one text that we should keep in mind, that there are many texts in diaspora itself, and that also relates with the position from which one has shifted to a position, to a chosen position, and their culture, their geographical, the territories from where they have gone, the language that they spoke here. So there are echoes of that language in the English that they have imbibed or they have written or they have been trying to cultivate. So diaspora is not just one diaspora, even if you look at the English writers. So you have one diaspora in A.K. Ramanujan kind of language that Ramanujan uses and the metaphors that he has, but you have an entirely different diaspora in the way an Agha Shahid Ali looks, for example, at his own condition and home, and then he thinks of Calcutta at the same time, thinks of Kashmir at the same time, thinks of Delhi. But you will see that there's a huge difference, and other writers also. So this diversity in diaspora is also to be taken into consideration in a big way. It really matters to us as the students of literature. Diaspora has these positive points. Now, we can also think of diaspora in some other manner, that it brings to questions many of the things that relates with the diasporic imagination. For example, how does a diaspora construct a homeland? These diasporic writers, how do they construct their Indias of different kinds? Then is that construction acceptable to us in India? or is it is acceptable to them? That is, if someone, if Bharati Mukherjee is writing that text, Jasmine, is it acceptable to us in India? And is the same text acceptable in US in the same manner? So this leaves us with a question whether Jasmine matters in the same manner here in Delhi or any part of this world, in Bengal, for example, or in New York or anywhere else. So does it mean in the same manner, the same text? Does it mean the same at both the places? The question is, how do you construct your homeland? Then the homeland that you construct, is that construction acceptable to me, to you, and the people, to places, different places? The relationship between the different constructions of India that you have in diasporic literature, is there any relationship interlinking between the interlinkages between these constructions of India? And is there a kind of linguistic and cultural configurations that go hand in hand with each other? And is the diaspora acceptable there? Means the Indian diaspora is acceptable there in the way that we have been trying to configure in our texts. There are many Indias of mine in Silicon, in South Hall, in Toronto, in Malaysia, in Singapore. So diaspora is not just one. So talking of diaspora in plain blanket term may not be doing justice with the whole thesis of diaspora as we look at it, because diaspora is not one big blanket term. It has had many connotations. I will just refer to 2-3 authors, one by just one sentence each. See, when Vasinji was asked a question, is there a literature of South Asian diaspora? Is there a literature of South Asian? Vasinji says, I'm not sure really. I'm not sure really. And then he says finally towards the end of that answer, so of course there is a feeling of being South Asian. I have a feeling of being South Asian, but there is no overt sense of a South Asian community. So in the first sentence, he says, yes, I have a feeling of that. Then he says, there is no overt feeling. In between, he exists in between. There is a kind of, the finality is not there. It's not final, it doesn't. But if you take a step further and you come to Salman Rushdie, who says that he's haunted by a sense of loss. This essay that Amjit has just mentioned, there is some urge to reclaim, he says. There is an urge to reclaim, to look back, and then finally says, to create our own imaginary homelands, Indias of the mind. Our identities, therefore, is plural as well as singular. And we straddle two cultures. By we, I mean the authors who write about this. And Rushdie then goes on to engage with this idea a little more detailed manner, and thinks of political exiles as diaspora writers, thinks of first generation migrants. Then he mentions affluent expatriates. Then he talks of naturalized Britons. Then he talks of people born here who never may have had laid their eyes on the subcontinent. Now, when he says that, we also need to keep into mind that all diasporas are not one, in the sense that this is the third generation of writers there. And those who went for the first time, and then their children, and after that their grandchildren. So there is a huge difference in the attitude that they have developed, the responses that they have been developing through these ages, about the 50 or 60 years involved in between. So you have the Indo-American diaspora, you have the Indo-Canadian diaspora, you have the Indo-British diaspora, and you have the Indo-Caribbean diaspora, Indo-African diaspora, and various kinds of diasporas that you have. So diaspora needs to be looked at a little more closely with the variety that it presents. Diaspora is a huge world, and it calls for great attention, so that we are in a position to explain its diversity in terms of the configurations that I have been trying to present before. When I think of diaspora, I thought of understanding for myself in this manner. In the university where I taught earlier, there's an auditorium, and I used to go to the auditorium quite often. And it happened to me once that when I arrive at that spot, that position where this auditorium is located, so I'm climbing the stairs. So this is one. I thought that this is a diasporic condition, in the sense that once you arrive in a foreign country, once you arrive in a country which is not yours, you have gone there for a job, you are going for greener pastures. So when you are on the staircase, you have arrived. You know that you have certainly arrived here. After that, you enter the foyer of the auditorium. You have come closer. You have come closer. You have crossed the steps. You are now in the foyer. And now after that, the gates of the auditorium open. And when you enter, you sit, take your seat, the assigned seat that has been given to you. Consider a city that has been given to you, or where you have arrived. So you take a seat in the auditorium. You finally sit there. Then your right and left, you see people who are not acquainted, whom you don't know, but then you smile at them. And finally, after a few minutes, the play starts on the stage. Now, this is a very difficult kind of a situation. Arriving at the staircase, then approaching the foyer, and then finally entering the auditorium and trying to connect with the people sitting right and left and front and back, and then looking at the drama that is going to be a stage of the theater that is there. Now, this is the diasporic condition. I thought that is how that we part from, how that we engage with the diaspora. So for me, that auditorium metaphor, it became a metaphor for me to understand what a diaspora means to me. How many stages do you really cross to be able to arrive finally and to be able to connect? So it takes time. It doesn't happen all of a sudden. So you go from a step to foyer to hall. So I try to understand it in a very different manner, which is not my phrase, which is given in critical theory. There are three stages which I thought that one is the stage of adopt. And from there you go to the stage of adapt. And finally you come to the stage of adapt. This is from a book that you have already read. Students must be aware of this, that how this is this in one of the positions of theory in post-coloniality. It was often talked about. Then there are three identities that a diasporic writer attains. There's a double identity. Then there's a divided identity, which is different from the double identity. And then there is a fluid identity. So all these writers are not writing the same kind of text. Then fluid texts are there, divided texts of divided consciousness, and double identity texts are there. All these texts basically bring before us the history, the myth, and the history, memory, and myth. All diasporic texts belong personally. So it relates again with the post-colonial question of hybridity and mimicry and difference and ambivalence and difference and universality and language and identity and so many things that come in between. Now, the questions that diasporic imagination engages with, my position is this, that diasporic imagination engages with a certain kind of a language. It evolves a certain kind of a symbolism, and it comes up with a certain kind of imagery. It tries to understand its personal truth in relation to the truth which is different from the one that he has been living with for a long time since his birth. It engages with one's ethnicity and with indigeneity and a kind of relationship that he develops or she develops while being in a different location. The impact of globalization, the intertextuality, as you said, the contextuality, as someone was mentioning. So you start constructing a homeland. So is this this is the land where I have to be? So this diasporic construction of India and the Indian construction of diaspora, these are the two things one has to engage with. So there is a sense of angst there. There is a sense of worry. There is a sense of fear. There is a sense of coercion. And all these things mixed together, they create a condition for the writer to wage through and to experience the world that he or she has been living with, and then to write about it. It is often, sometimes most of the texts are very repetitive. They use the same technique, the same manners, the same mannerisms, I would say. So there are a few issues that you come across with this. So there are locational variations, there are broad generalizations, there are texts of difference and diasporic markers that bring into focus the cultural autonomy, the cultural diversity. So uncertain texts are there, cultural uncertainty you can see in the diasporic text. You can see cultural texts emerging, cultural performance texts are there, cultural statements. These are texts of cultural statements and cultural objects and cultural productions that we come across while reading these. This literature, this question of identity, which my friend Amrit was just speaking about, I will just add that yet, of course, and one of the participants also mentioned that your identity or the identity of a diasporic writer is very closely associated with the socio-cultural markers. It is also a symbol or a historical sign. Your identity is also a historical question. It's a philosophical icon. It's a linguistic configuration. It works through its myth, through symbols, and through its imagery. So it's very clearly related with that. It depends upon who is putting this question, who you are, what is your identity. It depends who is the person who is asking this question. And it also depends on who is answering this question, because your identity changes with time, with place, and with condition. Therefore, the identity of the diasporic writer is also addressed by the reader. So the reader is asking who you are and what you intend telling me, and what does this text finally communicate to me. So these are the issues that come into consideration while reading a diasporic text. So what is your identity? The question is raised by the reader, and the reader would like to know. But this reader will have to be taken into consideration who this reader is for me, and therefore the author might be able to address that reader and tell that I come from this kind of a context and the background, this language, this myth, that this metaphor that I create. So the place and the conditions that it. So it's a peripheral identity sat next to the central identity. So this peripheral identity and the central identity, these two. So this diasporic writer has to engage with these two identities, the peripheral identity and the central identity. And then first, finally, you see that is assigned a new role for creating a new code. Say lots of things could be talked about while talking about diasporic literature and diasporic locations. One can talk about nationalism as well, civic nationalism or ethnic nationalism or cultural, what kind of nationalism one is trying to project there, or religious nationalism or diasporic nationalism, which is another question of engagement. I'm not going to engage with all those questions. I will simply come and try to bring the talk to an end by proposing an answer to the question which I have posed in the title of my talk. I said, does diaspora write from the margin? My submission is that diaspora does not write from the margins. This is number one. And my second, I would not be going into explanations of it because the time constraint is very much there. So my first proposition is that diaspora does not write from the margin. My second proposition is that it invents its own center. It invents its own center. I explain it further in the third proposition, which I make. It validates the so-called margin, so-called within quotes. It validates that margin, and it becomes, that margin therefore becomes his center. I personally have tried to understand it in this manner, and I finally propose that the diasporic writer writes from the center of the margin. He writes from the center of the margin. So he belongs to a center, but that center is very closely annexed to the margin. So he writes from the center of the margin. Therefore, he is not no one, he is somebody. He has to be taken into cognizance. He has to seek his identity. He has to seek his locale, and he has to find his questions for his own answers, and he has to find his text in order to be able to relate with the, find his text in the sense that he has to be able to relate with the readers. And therefore a text like Yasmin becomes so very controversial. So there are people who have liked that text. There are people who have criticized that text. Wonderful ways of looking at these questions. For me, Ekaramanchun's poetry and Aga Shahid Ali's poetries have been great help to understand diaspora and diasporic imagination broadly. But I personally feel that all these diasporic writers write from the center of the margin. So they have created their own centers in the margins, but still they remain at the margin because of the double consciousness, which Amrit was just saying, that there's a double cross. I would like to call it twin imagination, or two kinds of imagination, twofold imagination through which you come. I'm sure I have crossed my limit, my time limit. I will not be able to take it further along, and I think there should be a question and answer session after this. And thanks once again, friends, and Aparna, for this opportunity so that we can go further from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Anisur Rahman. That was a very impressive and constructive lecture for our students, researchers, and many of those people who are watching us live. Professor Anisur Rahman has brilliantly addressed the issue of marginality and centrality that continues to inform our understanding of various literary pedagogies and discourses, and including post-colonialism, postmodernism. His talk probed into the possible terrains of the very notion of diasporic imagination and nationalism. Very importantly, he mentions that diaspora does not write from the margins, but creates its own center. Diaspora and category formulations within diaspora have probably long crossed the binaries of us and them, and have long surmounted the regular tropes and that it moves around. And therefore, what his talk really focused on was the multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual paradigms. It's diaspora's multilingual paradigms, multi-ethnic, multicultural paradigms as a blanket unit can be, have to be looked at. The emergence of multiple diasporas within diasporas restrain any single ideological construct or apparatus around it. So a very informative and very edifying lecture, I must say. Thank you, Professor Rahman, and once again. And we may now take up a few questions from the YouTube viewers, participants, a few from the Zoom link participants, and perhaps the esteemed panelists, speakers can address to them accordingly. So, Professor Singh, would you like to take up a few questions that have been posed here? I'm sorry, just one moment. There's one of our senior colleagues, Professor Tirupati Kumar, who has just joined us, who is the rapporteur for this, this question and answer session. May I request Professor Tirupati Kumar to lead this question answer session? Professor Tirupati Kumar.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hello, everyone.
Hi. Hello.
Hello.
The session has been very interesting indeed. It raised several questions. I went into 20th century. I'm an old guy. I am a remnant of 20th century where multiculturalism, pluralism, identity were the prominent questions. In this 21st century, age of liberalization, all these questions have been marginalized. We had a very interesting sessions from the three speakers. There are also some interesting questions from the participants. I will read out some of the questions. Right, Kavita Sahu says, if the diasporic writers are so nostalgic of India, is any writer interested to come back to his or a native place and settle here? Do you have any idea of it? Can anybody take this question?
Could I come in?
Please go ahead, Professor Amit.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So thank you, Professor Tirupati. This question must have come from YouTube. I have several questions from the Zoom listeners, and I was going to answer them. Just to start with the question you raised, of course, there are writers who go back. I mentioned Krishan Baldev Vaid. He lived for 30 or 40 years in the United States. He was a Hindi writer. He was a department chair of English. He was a PhD from Harvard on Henry James fiction. And he returned to India because he felt that he could write better in Hindi if he lived in India. There were many others who had the opportunities to stay on in the United States or elsewhere, and they chose not to take those opportunities. An example comes to mind, Professor Ayappa Panikkar, who passed away a few years ago. He could have easily lived on in the United States after his PhD at Indiana University, and he was a Malayalam poet, and he chose to live in India. I was actually going to make a point in response to something that Professor Robin Field said. When she was talking about the last book, Meena Arora Naik's book, she said there are some positive things you can pick. Sure, I think the diaspora has the possibility of destabilizing certain kinds of perspectives. For example, I have been shuttling between India and the United States since 1968. That's ages me all right. That's 52 years, right? So even though I come to India more frequently than most NRIs do, having lived in United States and also having lived in Jaipur, Hyderabad, Delhi, I am always concerned about, for example, Indian families keep their homes spick and span. Go to Moti Bagh, go to Dhola Kuan area. And then there are these huge piles of garbage at the corner of the neighborhood. And you see cows and dogs eating plastic bags and so on. So you develop these new eyes for observing those kinds of contradictions. Why is it that people are so dedicated to keeping their places home, but they don't seem to be concerned about the level of pollution that they bring to the neighborhood, which has consequences not only for humans but also for other creatures. So there are many examples. There are questions from Chitra Nair and Saleh Sharka. I hope I don't mispronounce names. And then Huda Aladbi. I can quickly comment on that if there is time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Chitra is concerned with how the diasporic identity is a bundle of contradictions. I agree with that, because that was one of the points we're making. There are tensions, and Professor Rahman also referred to that several times in his talk. Saleh Sharka talked about how whiteness affects, and if you kind of embrace whiteness, do you lose your status as a person of color? Not necessarily, but whiteness is a very interesting discourse. I would strongly recommend a book by Matthew Fry Jacobson. Those of you who are interested, you can note down the title, and it's so easy to find these books these days. Whiteness of a Different Color. Whiteness of a Different Color. So he makes the point that whiteness was something identified with a particular white group, the WASP. Yeah, the white Americans whose heritage is in North Europe or Western Europe. So Italians and the Irish and the Polish and the Jews, they were all on the margins of whiteness. When they move from Europe to United States, they acquire whiteness. That gives them a sense of agency, a sense of power. But he goes on to then suggest, he also looks at African Americans, he also looks at Asian Americans, how this whiteness acquired by the marginalized white groups, the Irish and the Italian, who were hugely discriminated against when they came, it comes at the cost of, once again, African Americans and Native Americans. These two things get tied. So this is a very interesting thing. Here's a way of looking at the whole issue of identity and whiteness in its multi-layers through a book like that. There's another book called Whiteness by Law by Ian Haney, a professor of law, who looks at the citizenship issues relating to African Americans and Asian Americans. And I don't know if you have thought about it. I've given this talk in India several times. Just as African Americans coming out of Civil War, they begin to lose what they gained through the Civil War by 1877, the notorious compromise by which a man from Ohio, Rutherford Hayes, in order to become the president, he withdrew the federal troops. Asian Americans begin to have resistance to their becoming naturalized citizens. In the 1950s, 1850s, there were like 100,000 Chinese people. And then the arrival, they were not allowed to bring women, and then finally their immigration was stopped. I mentioned that earlier. That was done also to Japanese Americans and also to Indians. And in the process, Asian Americans were denied complete possibilities of migration and naturalization in 1924. It was reinstated in 1965 that I mentioned. So that was it. I think those were the questions. Professor Manju Jedka asked what are the possibilities of study. I think we should look at what has just been mentioned, diasporic writers who come back to India and diasporic writers who choose not to come back to India, what kind of contrast. And then there's the question about twice migrants from Huda Aladbi. Does partition allow this new identity? Yes, in some ways, yes. But definitely there's a whole idea of twice migrants by Parminder Bachu, who's a sociologist at Clark University in Massachusetts. She's talking about Indians who first went to East Africa, then they went to UK, and then they migrate to Canada and United States. How do you understand the diasporic thing through those kinds of migrants? I think because Robin and Anis may have other things to say, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is Robin? Robin has some questions.
Yes, so I lost connection in the middle of your words, Amarjit, so I don't know whether I missed some of the key information.
You have heard me too many times.
Well, one comment that I did want to make just before I lost connection, you were talking about how whiteness was obtained by immigrants from various countries in Europe who arrived in America. And I want to add to that by stressing the temporality and the intersectionality that informs that whiteness and that cultural acceptance as well, in the notion that, you know, Germans emigrated to the United States en masse in the 1850s and at the end of the 19th century, and were one of the largest ethnic groups. And then by 1920, we're one of the most hated ethnic groups because of World War I. And the German language disappeared, and the German culture voluntarily was given up in order to assimilate because of this prejudice against Germans because of the homeland, even though they were fully intending to stay in the host land. So I think that shows an interesting aspect to a terminal diaspora based on political circumstances as well. It connects with something you said in your talk, Amarjit, about the Rushdie quote saying writers and politicians are rivals, right? And I think that that is so true because politicians want certainty. They want to be able to say, this is who citizens of a country are, etc. And writers want to relish in the multiplicity of identity. And so certainly those of us in academia, I would imagine, want the latter as well. Like the three of us in our different ideas about diaspora, you know, we're circling back to some of the same ideas, but largely are agreeing that multiplicity and difference is key to understanding diaspora, that individuals themselves create their own understandings of the homeland and the hostland, and all of these are valid. And readers can take the same text, like Jasmine, and receive it differently based upon their own understandings of the place where they are, whether they might be in the hostland of America or the homeland of India. And that's the joy of studying a cultural production such as literature. A couple of questions that I noticed were directed towards me, I'd like to try to address very quickly here. Shyam Babu asked about decentralization of identity, and I agreed with his comment about fixed boundaries are boundaries are less and less actually fixed, right? And so multiplicity and decentralization is key. I agree with Professor Rahman about how we can say the writers write from the center of the margin, right? Center and margin are decentralized terms. We should no longer work with binaries, but look at multiplicity. I think the same question that Amarjit was directing toward Huda about the partition and specifically in the novel Jasmine, of this idea of two births, Amritjit and I agree that it's impossible to leave the history behind in the homeland and to have a very fresh start in the host land. This character, I think he and I disagree with the way we understand how she's created her life. But for me, the trauma is always informing her actions, her decisions, how she creates her identity. And so it's a less hopeful way of looking at identity formation in the host land, but one, the trauma is not easily resolved and is haunting. And so whether it's the trauma of rape and murder or the trauma of partition, it is a key element in identity. And then a last question that I noted was about rape victims. And I was asked whether they adopt an elite mentality after surviving trauma. And I'm not entirely sure what the idea of an elite mentality is, but I'm guessing it has the implication is that in becoming a survivor, there is a greater tenacity or a greater resilience or a greater strength. And I certainly would agree with that. As long as, again, we don't see a binary between either being a victim or a survivor, but instead the spectrum where a person can move between those extremes and exist in any particular place based on the daily circumstances, can embrace an identity of a victim hyphen survivor as the nomenclature, and can embrace both the pain of the past and the strength gained from surviving an experience. So I'll pause from there and let Professor Rahman take on questions addressed to him.
Hello, Professor Tirupati. I haven't looked at the chat box. Could you just tell me those questions so that I can respond?
One question, I mean, this is not directly for you. So the question is, Mahanta, last one. Vidya Dikshit says, do you think that the representations of the diasporic identity has been stereotypical in Indian cinema, and how does this undermine the efforts of the community?
Who do you want to answer this question? Who is it addressed to?
I don't know.
I think Anis, you should answer. It's a good question. How
it's a good question. It relates with cinema.
Yeah,
Yes, it relates with cinema, but it could also apply to literary texts as well. I understand that there's lots of stereotypical representation in both texts, literary texts as well as in cinema. But there is a difference also in some of the texts. I was just referring to two examples, and I will again go back to those two examples of Aga and Ikram. The kind of difference that they bring into the consideration and the way they look at home. For example, they take the entire baggage with them. Salman Rushdie also says that when I open the windows and I look as if there was Bombay moving on the road, the crowd. And Agha Shahid Ali says that I go back to the Bay of Bengal and while being somewhere else in US. So you exist simultaneously in two places, in two time frames, in two locations. So of course there is so much of stereotypical representation in both films, and films, since it caters to the larger popular imagination. So it goes to the stereotypical material. But there are some films, some documentaries made which are very distinct. For example, I don't recall the title of that film, but I can recall that there was one film which was a short film of an hour or so, which is about the struggle of a person who goes and tries to find his moorings, tries to find his job, and this is a very poignant film in which Saeed Jaffrey was acting. And it was a very explicit, he used very explicit terms there, the abuses, 4-letter words, etc. So that was the difference he was trying to make, that how a particular young man who travels and leaves his home behind, tries to disengage with home, but is finally not in a position to disengage with home. So there is the stereotypical representation, surely, but there are some authors who have made the difference. I personally think we have often referred to Jasmine more than probably we should have referred to, because this is a text which has been highly debated. I personally do not understand how it can be said to be a very, very American text. I do not understand so, because this might be a kind of a say way of projecting the text by the author herself, that this is what I have tried to say. We don't believe the author at all. We believe we in fact have to look at the text ourselves and see how it works, and how it works for me as well, for me and for you differently. So if you listen to the author, that is a typically American text, I personally do not believe that a writer should have said that at all. And if she says that a personal interview, fine, but we are not to be guided by that. So there are kinds of representation, many, many kinds of representation. And there's one point that I was trying to make, that diaspora is not just one thing, going from home and carrying a whole baggage of trunks and loads of memories, and then out of those memories you create your myths and your metaphors. So it's not just that. Everyone creates a different kind, but most of them are very stereotypical. The difference where it is made, that really stands by, and I understand the two poets that I refer to more especially, Shahid and A.K. Ramanujan, who make this difference.
Yeah,
Any other question where you would like me to answer, which is addressed to me? I looked at, yeah, please, Professor Tirupati.
Yeah, in the global context, our identity is, of course, very fluid.
Yes.
And has increasingly become an intellectually informed entity, where we know pretty well which side to oscillate towards homeland or host country. Diasporic identity.
This is a question which cannot be answered with any certainty whatsoever.
I mean, there is still the continuation. Diasporic identity in this context is not manifested in the manufactured in colonial produces only. It is also equally shaped by our ethnicity or origin culture. Diasporic culture thus has come over the precarious fixed boundaries because of its decentralization process. Kindly correct if my observation is wrong.
I think the observations, there are quite a few observations that has been made here, and all these observations hold very well. I would not contest with any of those, because talks of ethnicity and talks of multiple aspects that that a diasporic author has to take into consideration. So I personally understand that the points made by the person who's raising this question, don't know the name, hold very well. They cannot be negated as such. Very keen observations.
Yeah. May I add something, sir?
Yeah, please.
So first of all, there were a couple of other questions. One is a question from a Afghan research scholar, Gulab Mir Ramani. Yeah, he asked a question of me and Robin about discrimination. So definitely that relates to the question about the ethnic identity. A lot of Sikhs in Canada and the United States call themselves Sikh Americans, and other Indians would get upset with them. I don't have an easy answer. If for a diasporic person, his or her Sikh identity is more important, then I believe that they have the freedom to go that way. I personally, as a Sikh, identify myself more as an Indian American or even South Asian American, because I relate to people from the other parts of the subcontinent too. I have good conversations with diasporic people from Pakistan and Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and Nepal. I don't want to spend too much time on Jasmine. Both Robin and Denise have said things. I would just say that, Robin, that the idea that everything she's doing is out of trauma is kind of belied by a lack of responsibility, how she moves on from one situation to the other, how she leaves this handicapped Vietnam veteran and then goes on and then finally is coming back to New York. There's almost a sense that nothing is accruing. You see, first of all, Jasmine, Bharati Mukherjee's imagination of Jasmine is that even though she had very tragic circumstances, the husband getting killed by the militants and so on, that she can reinvent herself. I think that is very breezy. But her actions even later on in moving from one situation, one person, I mean, she was very involved in bringing up the stepson. So you don't suddenly leave someone you love in this way and feel that you are now free of those responsibilities. But I did want to address something that came up in some of the questions, but even the question of discrimination. You see, one of the things, definitely diaspora can push back on certain things developing. And of course, as I mentioned, that's not always received well back at home. But just think about it. There are Indians and South Asians in Canada or US who would be very concerned if their children, their sons and daughters get discriminated against. The same people in one body of a, Indian migrant or even a Pakistani migrant, they are willing to ignore or even support the oppression and suppression of minority groups back in India or Pakistan. So that a diasporic person will remind you of that contradiction. You need to confront this. How come you are in favor of minority rights in the United States because you and your children are a minority, but you cannot show any empathy or connection with the issues that the minorities in India are facing? You see, so that's one thing. But definitely there's a dialogic relationship, and there is a possibility for both sides to grow, but particularly the homeland, where many diaspora individuals remain emotionally and intellectually invested, and their perspectives, their imaginations should not be dismissed. Thank you.
Professor Tirupati?
Yes.
I've just looked at the chat box and a few things are there. So there are quite a few questions which are addressed to all, and I think Amrita and...
Yeah, you please go ahead.
I can't, anyway, I can't see anything. Yeah. So I'm not referring to those questions which have been addressed to everyone, but just saying that there are certain comments. Someone says, Bushra Khan says about my talk that it was intriguing. I take it as a compliment. Thank you, Bushra, for saying that. It was really intriguing. Then there is a question, a compliment coming from Professor Swaraj Raj saying about the margin and the center relationship and how I try to problematize that. Thanks. Chitra Nair and Alvina Shakil also talk about the way I try to problematize certain areas of diaspora and try to answer the question that I posed at the beginning of the talk. And Albina Shakil, as she was referring to the memory part of it, yes, we can't disengage from memory, Albina Shakil, because memory is the sum total of what these diasporic writers are trying to engage with. So disengaging from memory is in fact trying to disengage with one's own self. One cannot probably do that, and if one does that, one would not be in a position to create the text that a diasporic writer in fact tries to create, broadly speaking. So memory is the base, memory is the source, memory is the material from which you draw upon, and you draw upon that and you finally develop a text. Thanks very much for all these questions. 6-7 questions were there addressed to me, and thanks to all those who tried to put these questions. And since I would like to be very precise, I would not like to develop further on these. Thank you very much.
I see a question has been posed to me for a second time, so I'll quickly take it up if you do not mind. From Gulab Mir about whether identity and race in terms of Black and white are still an issue in diaspora communities in the United States. I would say absolutely. Race cannot be taken out of any equation in the United States. It is fundamentally built into the bones of American society, a white supremacist culture. And so the power that the white community holds in government, in culture, in all facets affects all diaspora communities within the United States. And back to what Amritjit was saying about how diasporans themselves may decry discrimination in the United States, but say not back in India or Pakistan, etc. I mean, the same can happen in the United States, as he knows as well, that certainly there could be a critique of discrimination against the South Asian community, even while the community participates in anti-Black racism and aligns itself with white supremacist culture in order to try to access some of the power that is created by being against African Americans and that history of anti-Blackness in the United States. The situation asking for a solution, it's imperative to be talking on an individual basis about this question, but also to be working on the systematic dismantling of white supremacist systems within the United States as well. So while individuals can be very important on their own, individuals are not going to solve this deeply embedded problem in the US.
May I add a sentence or two, sir?
1 second, sir. I will come back to you.
Okay.
There are 3 interesting questions. Is diasporic writers suffer from a kind of alienation? That is from Abriti Thakur. Yeah. Just a second.
Yeah.
Then Sushita Sharma, she asked how cultural clashes occur in diasporic literature. There's a third interesting question. This is the Mahanta Satyam Petas. We are living in a globalized, digital, and most importantly, in post-truth era. How does diaspora discourse help us to understand the problems? Maybe the global problems like terrorism and violence. These are the 3 questions which remind me to focus on the very concept of this webinar. Diaspora, gender, and marginality. Diaspora, I'm sure, has contributed in enlightening and empowering the consciousness of definitely our students and our colleagues. But at the same time, we also see a problem with diaspora. Diaspora is always associated with victimhood. There are multiple identities within a diaspora. Diaspora is also engaged in not only...
Sir, can I say something?
Yeah.
I think the panelists have tried their best to answer the number of deliberations that were raised very, very efficiently and effectively. And Professor Anisur Rahman's talk did mention about, how he spoke of these multiple diasporas within diasporas and how, it's very multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural fabric. Its paradigms as a blanket unit becomes a distortion of its polyphonic reality. And I think his talk largely centered around that. And to all the other participants who have been raising questions on YouTube and Zoom link, we're trying to, address those questions at best, but please do reserve your questions for day 2 sessions as well, because some of the speakers are going to address certain issues, relevant issues, of course, that have been raised by you. I think our panelists from the US have been sitting for a very, very long time. And I admire them for their remarkable patience, and of course, despite the gremlins and the technical hitches that we initially began with, obviously, this is new for all of us.
and we're learning, we're learners. And despite all that, they have been sitting here patiently. They have taken up relevant issues they felt were compatible to their talks. I would come to the last leg of my day one webinar today, which is a formal but very intrinsic part, I must say, and that's the vote of thanks. And with that, of course, we would conclude. To begin with, of course, my humble gratitude goes to the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor E. Suresh Kumar, for dexterously going through my proposal, approving it, and sanctioning my webinar, my proposition. So I am greatly obliged to the Vice Chancellor, to the Honorable Vice Chancellor, for taking up my proposal. A big, big thank you to all of you wonderful panelists who've been communicating with me, who've been motivating me. It really meant a lot. Professor Amritjeet Singh, Professor Robin Field, Professor Anasur Rahman, thank you so much. Many, many thanks. I really owe it to all of you for making my day today with such wonderful, wonderful talks and presentations. I would like to thank my colleagues, Professor Samson Thomas, who incidentally couldn't get into the Zoom link, and then he had to eventually rush for another meeting. Professor Prakash Kona, I really didn't know if he was around, but then there was some miscommunication, but he was here around. So Prakash, you have to forgive me that bit. Professor Tirupati Kumar, who tried his best to lead the deliberations. My colleagues from the Foreign Languages Department and other departments and from the School of Literary Studies, I thank them all for sharing this widely on Facebook, on social media, because of which we had nearly 1,500 registered participants. I'm sure the number will be more tomorrow. I would like to thank the Department of Literature, the office staff, my research scholars, particularly Sandhya, Gauri, and more importantly, Bhupati, who has been co-hosting this with me, who's been monitoring this, Hatim Al-Shama, who has stood like a rock. He's been spending sleepless nights with me, Abdul Wajid, Fazil Ataullah. These are some of my Yemeni and Afghani scholars who have been doing things round the clock for me. So an enormous and a big thank you to them. And to that research and student community out there who's watching so patiently and sending me these motivational messages. I think it's you who make this webinar a success. So, and to everyone out there in thousands who are watching this being live streamed, a huge, huge thank you for that overwhelming response. I would like to thank the Dean Technical Infrastructure, particularly for providing this, I should say, computer room today, since for the last 3 days, it has been raining incessantly with power cuts and other issues that we have been having. The technicians that he has deputed so that we run the function, the webinar smoothly, Mohan, Moen, and others who are here who've been helping me with the technical know-how and so on. And I think more important, to those who raised questions which were really compatible and relevant to the talks that our panelists presented. So I thank you once again. We kickstarted it really well. My humble gratitude again to my panelists who've joined from US in the wee morning hours. I should say the time zone is huge, and I'm sure they are exhausted now. But we look forward to having you here again. And it was really, really my pleasure, and I mean it, from my heart, to have interacted with you. And I'm going to ensure that we would have you many more times in the future. So once again, a big, big thank you to all of you. With this, I would like to conclude the day one webinar.
Yeah.
And a little reminder regarding the feedback form, which has been posted. Kindly ensure to fill in the feedback form that has been posted. It's only then that the people who fill that feedback form will be issued an e-certificate after a few weeks. So thank you once again to all. Goodbye.
Aparna, may I say something?
From
Hello, Aparna?
Yeah.
Yeah, may I say something? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can-
Go on, Amar.
Yeah. Okay. I know after the vote of thanks, generally nothing is said, but I want your permission to read a short poem. It'll take 1 minute.
Of course,
It's
you're
by,
most
it's
welcome.
it's by Langston Hughes.
Oh, my favorite.
I too sing America. I'm the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. Now I have a poem called I too sing India, but I don't think we want to hear that. Maybe tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity,
you for,
Aparna. Wonderful being together. Wonderful being together. Thanks a lot. See you tomorrow.
Thank
I
you
hope
so
the
much.
same link works tomorrow. The same link works tomorrow as well.
The same Zoom link works tomorrow.
Right. See you tomorrow.
See you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Wonderful.
Good night.
Night and a very good morning there to all.
Yeah, now I need
Bye-bye.
something to eat.
Yeah,
Sure.
please go ahead.
It's 10 o'clock here.
All right. Goodbye, all of you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Time
you.
for
Bye.
breakfast.
And to all those who've been part here in the Zoom link, thank you. Some of the senior professors I haven't mentioned, but thank you so much for being here.
Bye-bye.